In Houston, I'm John Herder. Tuesday, the 21st day of May. Great as always to have you along, everybody. From the Experts is a virtual networking opportunity flow accelerator, helping leaders across industries connect very quickly in a brief, moderated, interactive show format. Yeah, it's like a TED Talk with interaction. All goes well, curiosity is sparked, new ideas accelerate action. You may have helped yourself or someone else solve that problem, make a connection, reaching the opportunity faster. Folks, help me welcome guest expert Stephen Eliuk. Stephen is Vice President, AI and Governance, and he heads a global team that delivers cutting-edge technology and service for privacy, AI readiness, and data management across all of IBM globally. Welcome, Stephen. Grateful to have you on with the group to explore AI governance. What's on the horizon, what's critical to nail down, and the key risks to watch out when adopting AI into your operation. Over to you, Stephen.
Everyone, thanks so much for being here today. John, thanks for having me. Everyone, I think as I opened this call earlier, just a few minutes ago, I said that we're just talking about this topic, which is so important to me and the community. So these are the first steps, and I just appreciate everybody listening in. So hopefully you'll pull away some of the guiding principles that I'm trying to hand off to you, and we'll be able to answer some of your questions. So at the 10,000 foot level, everything under the sun is trying to be AI. Use AI, powered by AI. Everything we hear is claimed to be done in an ethical way, sustainable ways. The fact from the fiction, though, is it takes experience, understanding, and expertise to create impactful enterprise use cases, which are sustainable. Okay. Now, the big issue is one can demonstrate this and talk about it. Sorry, I just have some pop-ups here. And give examples of use cases that are said to be built correctly. But these practices are not consistent typically. You'll hear somebody marketing a product or marketing their company and such, and it's great to hear that, but just in terms of across the board, they're typically not implemented in the right ways. So that's a big issue, even from the thought leaders that we refer to, like the Googles and the Amazons and IBMs and such. Like there's just the consistency, I think, is difficult across these very large companies. We need more focus on a common set of requirements and tools. Think ML ops to enable developers and users because they're under information overload too. So expecting everybody to do everything is problematic. So we have to instrument and help them as much as possible. So think about that. And that produces reproducible outcomes and common metadata behind the scenes if you're able to do it. Now, why this matters to your business, future-proofing your solutions is really important, okay? So think about this as an investment. You invest now or, pay later in a certain realm. If you're building one-off solutions, that's a good, critical point that you should reanalyze and say, hey, does this make sense? Is this sustainable? If I multiplied this 1,000 times, would it really make sense? Okay. Now, let's just take some of the bigger questions here, and then I'm going to refer back to those. So I just want to kind of give you some seedings, and then we're going to, handle all of those seedings with a single statement, okay? Now, why are regulators heavily focused on AI, and what are they looking for? Okay, so keep that in your mind. How do we establish and align robust AI baselines covering personas and stakeholders throughout the business, everybody who's involved, okay, and how to plan and prepare for ethical debt and models that are coming out, how do we make sure they're sustainable? So all of those things are the questions that people are grappling with. Everybody wants to meet and talk about these types of things. So in a nutshell, what you can take away is we can handle nearly everything that I just threw at you if we collect metadata around the development. Think of the what, the who, the when, the why, and the how. All of these pieces of metadata that go along with the development and instrumentation and rollout and operation of the use case is really important. Okay, so consider the data. Where is it from? How is it used? What is the justification of that use? And how easily can we remove said training data if required to do so? And why do we want to talk about that? Think privacy, sovereignty, licensing, copyright, etc. If you build, say, $100,000 model or $1 million model or a $10 million model or a $100 million model, do you want to throw it away tomorrow? Because that's the implications for doing this wrong. Okay. Now, the solution. Okay, these are specific guiding principles that I want to bring back to you. Automation and service level instrumentation. You want to instrument as much as possible because, again, information overload. Everyone's not going to do what they need to do. If they operationalize something and send it out and it used potentially copyrighted information or information that is no longer licensed or potentially export control or potentially blackout period data. That's a huge problem for you. So you have to really know what's going into your models and how you're building them, okay? The key methodologies, so how are you storing this? Because you're going to want to store it in an effective means. So your ability to store it and retrieve information will enable you to adapt to new regulation as it comes in, right? So all of that metadata out there, think of it as like searchable information that as new regulation comes or restrictions come or understanding is required, you're able to pull at it. So as another example, if we want to skip the regulatory aspect, we can skip back to maybe it's the developer or that key persona that is using what you're building. What if they don't come into work one day? What happens then? Are you stuck? Can you no longer reproduce the model? Is the business relying upon the model and it's stale? All of these items you really need to take into practice and make sure that every day, you're analyzing that process, okay? Now, the other one is around ethical debt. Now, from that point of view, if you're not doing it along that path, it's going to get to the end where you're now wanting to release this said model, and you're going to have to either kind of like build up all your ethical responsibilities or assume the risk and then release, right? So if we build up the ethical requirements as we go along, we have that really clearly understood, then at the end of the day, we don't have to kind of go back and backtrack and fill in all that information, which gets really expensive to do. Now, the other point that I like to use is like, you can assume the risk, and that's a big item that a lot of companies are doing right now. I'm not going to get into the specifics of which companies, et cetera, but like there's a lot of information that's used from, the web, from copyright material, from wherever they can get it, they're just using it. Now, that's a lot of risk that goes into that, right? There's a lot of, copyright information in there. There's a lot of privacy related information in there. So, do you enjoy your sleep? Does your company enjoy? Does your risk officer enjoy? Does your legal officer like to be fighting these types of things? You don't have to do it that way, but the key is to understand where the data is being collected. And developers and model builders are really bad at doing that. So make sure you get in practice a really good pipeline to kind of understand that. Okay. Now, going back to kind of like the critical items that I want you to take away today, and then we're going to get into some of the discussion points. And we can bring up some of the slides too. I think it's important that we can take a look at those slides. Skills. Let's not get and go beyond that fact. Skills are incredibly important. So we might hear things are getting easier and you can do things in the easy way. The realities are it's truthful. You can test the waters, understand items. You can use APIs. You can use ChatGPT. You can use all of these interesting things. But if you want to really practice it, get into, sustainable state, really making impact into the business, you need skills. You need people that have done it before. You need people that understand the implications of a stale model or a model that has drift or a model that was built incorrectly and you spent a lot of resources and ultimately you can't use that data and now you're assuming the risk. These skills are really important. There's different types of skills. Subject matter experts need to be part of it. Data engineers need to be part of it. Business stakeholders need to be part of it. But then core AI experts, they're very thin. There's people that can use AI, they can use the APIs, they can show a good use case, but if they've never really done these things in practice, it's a big problem. So remember, skills are important, experience actually doesn't matter. As much as we're making it easier, you need those skills in your business. So don't underestimate that point. Or what you're going to deal with is an incredible amount of latency or problems with your use case once it goes into practice. Now, the other one being know your data, know your models. You need to do this effectively because if not, some of the regulatory aspects, which we see that on the regulatory map, we're just getting more and more of this. We're getting state level requirements. We're getting country level requirements. We're going to see tons and tons of regulations around AI, around data, around sovereignty, all of these items. We can actually handle it if you collect the data and understand what you're doing. But if you don't do it, then you're going to assume risk, etc. Okay. Now, the final one being, you need to continuously validate your solutions. And from that, prepare to revisit your models, right? I meet with companies that say, hey, we don't have consumer-centric models. We're just impacting our internal business. We have dashboards going to CEOs that are based on it, or to our executive leadership team, or to our resellers, et cetera. Doesn't matter. The business in itself is being held up now by a portion of AI. So if you have stale information or you have drift, I can promise you that model is not performing as well as you think it is. So you need to continuously monitor these models and validate it against, a set of criteria that you think is important to the business. And you need to continuously validate that set of criterion that is important to the business as well. So this isn't just talk though, and that's the big thing that we need to get changed is we got to stop talking about it so much, having consistent practices across the business instrumented for every one of the use cases, right? Now, I think the final statement that I'll make is that there's a whole bunch of industry thought leaders that a lot of people aren't looking towards right now that we need to look more towards. Industries that have been heavily regulated in this space or in the financial sector, anybody be dealing with, insurance, with health, there's a lot of thought leaders in this space, but because they've never been known as thought leaders in AI, we're not looking to them so much. But a lot of those practices that they adhere to in their sectors, we need in general AI community to adhere to some of the same fact collection and level of detail that they preserve, within their areas. So excited about today. I do have some selfish intents. I'm really interested to hear about your questions and such. And again, it's just a really great opportunity to be with you and that you're wanting to be here and learn more about this subject. Okay.
Yeah,
Thanks,
thank you,
Steve.
Stephen. So I'm going to share the results here so you can look at it. And while I do that, folks, if you're new to the FT show, this is the group discussion. We've got a couple questions in the chat. And so we're going to open the floor and you can raise your hand using the tool. And you can also pass when I call on you to ask you for your opinion. You may have a question for Stephen. You may have a use case. There's all kinds of things in this really important topic that's going on here. So if you could introduce yourself really briefly and say who you're with and what your question is, that'd be great. Any reflection on the poll, Stephen, that you looked at, the
Well,
results?
I'm really happy to see, people kind of aware of the fact that we're going to have a lot of regulation. So if you look at how many unique AI regulations will we see by 2025, I think everybody is accepting the fact that we're going to have a lot. Okay, we already have several. I think the New York City employment decision one was the first one that we broadly knew about. EU AI Act, there's country specificity that's coming to that, all the state level stuff. So it's great that you're aware of that. Please take it back to home, make sure people understand it's not one and done. This is going to be an evolutionary basis, and there's going to be a lot of these, so be prepared for them. The other one being how much time is spent. This is also something that people need to understand too. If you don't put the time in now, you're going to put it in later. And actually, this can be an enabler. And I'm happy to, have a discussion even today about how that can be an enabler for your company. But really, it's not just about the regulatory concerns. This is about creating sustainable use cases within the organization that continue to have impact for the business, right? It's not just about showing something interesting because your manager wants to see it or you need your shareholders to see that, check mark next to AI. It's about real business impact. Okay. Yeah, that's great.
Sounds good. So, Brett, would you be able to share some of your thoughts from what you're seeing out there? Or anybody else, just raise your hand. Be glad to. You have to unmute yourself.
Yeah,
I
I'm
can see
just
that.
remaining optimistic. Thanks, John.
Please go ahead. One more time.
Well, I said I'm just remaining optimistic, and I liked what Stephen was saying about not utilizing existing tribal knowledge and trying to look at AI as something very specific that that we haven't covered. That we haven't crossed those bridges before. When in fact there's a lot of tribal knowledge out there that that can be employed.
Yeah, no, 100%. Like, I think if we take that and we just, spin it a little bit, we think of like, if we were to design, if NVIDIA designed AI chips, kind of like how the industry generally is doing AI, we wouldn't have functional AI chips. Like there's a process. It doesn't need to be waterfall. It needs to be, an augmented version of waterfall with agile considerations. There's kind of like this gross assumption that waterfall means like, we stick to what we decided upon, when that's not the case. We always update and consider when we know things are wrong, we want to update solutions. And I think like just if we look at those reference solutions in terms of how hardware is built, we have to consider that, right? Yeah, in a similar way for AI.
So I think Gus is going to drop these in. Some folks that gave questions before the show, how do you actually ensure data security and privacy when using them to train or RAG with enterprise data?
Well, I think what's important is to document the use of it. Take checkpoints along the way. There are some more cutting edge techniques where we're able to create kind of like ensembles of techniques that go in, and that ensemble has, you know, specificity to the specific area that you're trying to preserve. And then, you know, there's synthesized data too, where it's like we've been able to show really concretely that synthesized data does really well in this domain. That said, there is a performance degradation, but is it important to your use case? Can you justify it? Because if I can remove all risk from it using synthesized data and show you a 2 or 3% performance drop, that seems pretty acceptable, right? Because that model that you built is then, you know, more sustainable. You know, you're not potentially into an issue. The other one being is like around licenses and copyright, like what you have access to today versus tomorrow. If you don't preserve that information or being expected like to adhere to that license agreement for, you know, the foreseeable future, that becomes very problematic, right? So just knowing your data, when it was used, how it was used is super important. But that's all that process about how the model was built. You need to curate that. Okay.
You know, there's a couple that are around AI baseline. One of them is, could you give a really brief use case to demonstrate how to prepare for this ethical debt and transparency risk? And then the second one, which I'm not sure I really understand, but it's like, how could you, what AI prompts would you give to others to learn more in this area of AI baseline?
Well, I think, and I think it's a really good topic to touch upon. So let's describe what an AI baseline is first versus kind of diving into a use case and how the baseline can help you. Okay, so the AI baseline and what I've been coaching a lot in this area is like, don't take a regulation and say, okay, that's our baseline, and then build off of that regulation. You should take an understanding of your company's setting and how you work with consumers, how your internal risk appetite is and how it has been, how many revenue streams you have that are feeding off of you know, some of the AI potentially in the use case that you're working from. Take YouTube or something, you know, like a big revenue stream coming to a company. How are you impacting that? So you have to really define what your baseline is, like who works with the data, why are they using it, was attribute-based access control used? And the reason that I bring things like that up is like when you actually really understand how a piece of data is used for a specific use case, you get to do a lot of things and preserve a lot of that information. The common mentality of developers and people generally is like, I have access to the data, so I can use it wherever I want to. That's not actually the rules and actually some of the legal requirements around it. It's about acceptable use of that data within the use case that is specified. Okay. So once you understand your company's baseline, then you start to layer on the additional regulations on top of it. There's going to be a lot of overlap in those regulations, right? So once you get this basis done, then the amount of additional work you have to do for each regulation sometimes is nil, sometimes is minor. You launch campaigns across the company to fill in the information that you're missing to continue to govern what you're required to govern. Like, let's say today we have a model. And let's use it something not so much the regulatory aspect, but just in terms of governance aspect. Today we have a model, we release it across, you know, 160 countries. Tomorrow we learn of, you know, potentially our license around parts of the data that went into that, you know, we're no longer going to renew that license. So then we look at within the baseline, where was that data used, which models was constructed, what's the provenance and lineage of that, and then we can go back and say, what would the business impact be if we didn't renew this contract for said license data? And then you can imagine other areas like, you know, if we are required to remove certain pieces of privacy related information because of the right to be forgotten, how do we do that? Where was the data actually used? You know, all of these things are really important. And if you don't understand that basis or be able to search across all the models and data and how they were used, you're never going to really be able to kind of move directly, not kind of, you'll never be able to be sure about how the models are going to be used and potentially the risk that could come out of them. There's other areas too, where, you know, high risk areas, medium risk areas, you know, areas that might tarnish a brand or something. There's different ways to construct these items to prevent potential implications of hallucination in the case of LLMs. There's different ways to do this, but if you don't catalog it and understand it effectively in your baseline, it'll be very difficult to understand which ones are doing what, so that then you can target your remediations in that specific area.
Got it. So we have a few questions, and I'm going to ask Heminder, would you mind asking your questions to Stephen and tell everybody who you are?
Hi, Stephen. Thank you. Thank you for sharing a lot of good insights in a very short time. Any comments on observability and its implication for governance and regulation?
So I got the observability. I missed the latter part of it. And
so its implication for governance and regulation, because as far as laws are concerned, or anything, justice, whatever it is, or for any laws, for ownership, without observability, how do you establish that? And it's a very difficult problem for generating it.
That's the observability and ownership of the materials. Is that what it was? Okay. Yeah. Well, I think it's really, really important. And I think I'll just refer back to Elon Musk, in one of his statements around, who's using what data, and companies swear they're not using copyright data. I think if we refer to what he said, a lot of people are using this type of data. Now that said, you have to I think generally in practice, a lot of the practitioners in this space just fully go out and use data. And that's a problem. It's a problem for companies. It's a problem for the industry generally, and the public's perception of the industry too. I think it was just on the news the other day, Scarlett Johansson. I don't know the validity of any of this type of stuff, that they approached her to use her voice. She said no, and they let alone, created something that sounded quite like her, right? Like, a lot of groups are going around a lot of these items, and I think we got to just be more careful. And these are my personal views in this area. Like, I think it might be harder to catalog the data, to understand the data, but I think there's enough data out there that you can get rights to and do things right and adhere to the license that's usually attached. There's actually standards in this area around acceptable use of data. But I feel that there's too many groups that are just using it generally, right? And that it goes inside companies as well. It's like around, take export control data or blackout period data. Like, if you're using these things and you're building models, there is risk involved with what you're doing, right? So you got to be careful about that. Now, that continuously monitoring of the model too, in terms of how it's being used, the red teaming that goes along with it. So you should go through a proper process if you're building even small scale models, simple language models. What is its acceptable use? What's the grounds of use? Is it being used in that manner? Are you open sourcing it? Is it, closed or mildly open, where people can use it but you can pull it back? These are all things that you should really understand about the company's appetite for that risk, right? Because once something's out there too, it's not like open source software. Like, it's out there forever. So if you did something wrong, it's out there, right? So it's not like, people go and they build a new version and the old version never is seen again. That data is out there forever, right? So there's a lot of implications in that area. And then just that continuously monitoring of what it's doing, validating that it is doing what you expect it to be doing, right? It's important. And then beyond, just one last statement, I'll turn it back over to you. Beyond the group that's doing it, that red teaming aspect, the auditor aspect is really important, because what we find more often than not is the criteria that the owning group has, the developers of the model, versus the criteria that an outside group would have on it is very different. So what is the happy medium of those, right, when they come together? Okay, but back to the person who was asking your question.
That's great. So we have a couple more questions. Raul, would you mind just asking your question aloud?
Sure. Hi, Steve. Thanks for sharing. Yeah, I'm just wanted to know your opinion on best practices to set up a governance council or something within an organization. I feel that there's a tendency for the technical folks to be attracted and say, no, I'm gonna lead it. I know everything because it's AI. So just wondering what's best practices to set up the governance.
Yeah, well, I've been working on a governance board. I represented like 35,000 employees at IBM as the board member, and I've seen how this has worked successfully. And it's one of the big reasons I actually work at IBM, because how successful it is. Now, I think when you look at how to set that up internally at a company, there's a lot of differences, though, depending on the industry that you're working on, the number of revenue streams that you have within the company, how you lay that ethics board and the ownership out. Because like if you only have a couple revenue streams, it's very difficult for the ethics board to be impactful in that area, because as soon as you start questioning things and if they have high revenue impact to the company, then usually see that board get dismissed or moved out, right? So like it's really about the company's appetite. And then just like SecOps and just like audit typically internally for a company, these are groups that are without ownership typically, because as soon as there starts to be an SVP or an executive VP or something with ownership over it, what happens then is they get biased, right, by that individual. You need to be outside of the typical guardrails of the company. You can't, just because you make a statement, and it has to be done in a cordial, private manner within stakeholders, and the company has to be aligned to it, but you should be able to be critical without, your job being impacted from it. Like your job is to be critical of these solutions, right? So again, legal is a really important area. There's a great kind of awareness from the risk officer point of view within the company. I think we can take it back to the board. We've been very successful at IBM with our board support of this area and pushing it. But then IBM is also unique too, because it has so many revenue streams from so many different areas. We're really able to be very clear about areas that we want to work in and areas that we're going to choose not to. But there is a lot of challenges, and then it takes a certain type of person too. I'm a firm believer that everybody has a place at the table, and they have a set of kind of attributes that they bring. But at the ethics board, you kind of have to remove a certain type of person from the table, because if they're like, I've seen it with salespeople, I've seen it with technical folks, where it's kind of like, well, you're just gonna stagnant innovation or provide stagnant innovation to an area. And it's like, well, that's not actually the case. Let's try to find a happy medium to it. But we can't just push forward, because what are the casualties of it? Like these could be real people that are impacted. These could be societies as a whole that are impacted, right? And if we don't start considering these can have great implications for the world. And we can look back upon this technical revolution and say, hey, these black swan events that happened in these countries, like, was it really worth it? Like think about how these language models are produced. They're built on Western-based data. 80% of the data out there, probably more, is based on Western-based data, right? How acceptable is that in other countries? So we're creating summarizations, or we're creating content, and they're using it in maybe a technical support ticket, or maybe it's an essay that a child or a student is submitting, and it has some differing views than that society. What are the implications of that, right? So like, I think there needs to be greater awareness of these and less of the pass off, right? Where a lot of companies are protecting themselves, like, well, you didn't read line 17 of the end user license agreement that says you shouldn't use this for medical diagnosis. It's like, well, you shouldn't have given that medical diagnosis. Come on, like, let's be realistic here. Nobody reads all of that stuff. You're going to expect that 14-year-old kid to come on and say, yes, I'm over 18. Like, let's be realistic here, and stop passing the buck off to try to, protect yourself, right? But that's one guy's thoughts, okay? That's not even a representation of IBM. That's my thoughts in that space.
Thanks, Stephen. So, Ron, what's your take? What's your question?
Well, I'm setting up an AI practice, and certainly, we have an AI leadership, workshop that precedes the AI Lighthouse. But the COE and the governance, I think at the project level, it tends to be steerco oriented, but there is this idea that's deeper around governance, for sure. And certainly your advisement around the power structure of revenue lines, and that it kind of draws some boundaries for me in understanding. But when it comes to setting up AI governance, two things. One, do you think it's necessary as you get the Lighthouse project going? And secondarily, when you think about AI governance and the COE, what are the elements within that need to be present? Is it the ethics of AI, responsible AI, just internal policies for data use, and other things that you want to kind of bring the organization up to speed on? You know, what do you see as the constitution of that?
Yeah. Well, I think the analysis, and maybe we'll go in a little bit of reverse order there. The analysis of like, let's say, where you want to go with the use case or AI is really important, because like if your goals are, you know, worldwide, working across all the industries, et cetera, and that's what you're using to attract investors, you know, to buy into this, or, you know, your investor might be a key stakeholder within the company, but you'll never be able to fulfill that because you know the implications of running that across the globe, or the training that needs to go in, or the single models that have to be produced for the regions, you know, within that scoping. So if you're not experienced enough to take all of that into account, you're kind of selling a pipe dream that's not really realizable, and it's only going to happen later on, right? So really understanding the intended use is really important, and not thinking like, oh, I'll worry about that later. There's some things you need to think about now, and that general market direction needs to be considered. What was the first part of the question? Can you remind me? I
Well,
wanted to come back to it.
setting up lighthouse projects for AI as a
Yeah,
follow-on
yeah,
to
perfect.
leadership.
Yeah, that's what it was. So like
And
what
then-
I've been sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. And just the context of the COE, when's the right time? And then as part of the COE, what are the elements you see that at that stage make it helpful?
Yeah. So I think it's really important to give groups the ability to test and to, you know, see the art of the possible. Okay. So I've been actually I've set up this practice at IBM, like I've the genesis of it. And a lot of companies actually adhere to this. These 30-day playgrounds that we kind of give people in groups where they can come in, they can work, they can do things. And you know what happens in 30 days? No matter what, it's 100% deleted. Every part of that namespace, every part of the computation, every part of the data, it cannot be kept around it. It doesn't matter the SVP approval, executive VP approval, whatever it would be, someone was sick. That's the process, right? And you shouldn't be building anything there that is just so cutting, bleeding edge that you can't deal with that. This is an area that you can go, feel unconstrained, and test the art of the possible, right? Knowing that the implications of it will just disappear in 30 days. That's really a great enabler for a company internally. Now, how do you translate that? You know, where do we take it when we're starting with one of these, you know, ideation phases and moving it into something that's more justified for the company? That's when you get into the whole ROI, the checklist that you got to go through that is unique to your company, to say, hey, what is the ROI for this? How is it prioritized? What is the meaningfulness to what we're trying to do? Is this, you know, trying to increase revenue by the 2%, or is this trying to target a new area, you know, or like, that's the analysis that needs to take place. And one of the things that I think is most impactful is to really cut out those people that just, you know, they can put up their hand and make it move forward. Really justify it through data. If it's just a charismatic individual, that goes really far sometimes, and we see a lot of that in marketing, but ultimately the long-term implications of it usually fall flat. So we really need to justify it. And that comes from the instrumentation, understanding the hard data, justification of that. And then get the charismatic individual to present real data.
Interesting. So, okay, real quick, Ron, but because we got two more people behind you.
Yep. Just the heat map on quick wins then, you know, moving from the candy store and the playground, right, into heat maps, then you really want to make sure that it's not, let's say, we've got the data, but also the business case for the quick win that isn't, you know, it's sustainable. I mean, what's your advisement there? Because a lot of times the mobilizers inside the organization, the social capital, really, they've got the megaphone and they get charisma, et cetera.
I know, yeah. I think the SMEs, to make sure that those that are currently in the practice really buy into it is really important, because there's people with subject matter expertise, and it's like sometimes you meet with these people after the fact and it's like, are you guys kidding me? Really? And they're like, you can't do it because it's like, it's showcasing privacy related information. And they're like, well, you know, it's for the better. And it's like, no, you can't, you know, like, but you can think of this, like, if we go back to some of the earlier tidbits that I was giving you, like really guiding principles to take away. Let's say we curve this a little bit and take one of those practices and let's say, hey, as that individual who was testing the waters brought in privacy information and alerted them to say, hey, did you know that if you ever want to productize this, it's not going to work. Do you think they would have continued to go down that route? They only go down that route and they are only defensive because they built something that they like and they know that going back would be really hard. But trust me, if you instrument code, if you instrument that ideation phase and guide them and give them incarnate or ideas that, hey, this could be problematic. If it goes internal, it's fine. If it goes external, problematic. Like all of these things, people usually make the right decisions. It's only once they've made something that then they have to, retrospectively go back where they get super defensive. Yeah.
Thanks. Hey, Raj, would you go ahead and share now?
Sure. Hey, Stephen, nice to connect outside of IBM as well. So, quick question on folks directly involved with the development, like the technical leads or data scientists, AI engineers. What's a good trade-off between getting involved when building these AI regulation pipelines during the development phase? Because there's always this zeal to get things built first and then improve, set up pipelines, set up test suite and test cases to regulate things. But ideally, like using, say, products like What's Next governance or other regulatory tools during the development phase would be the best practice. But sometimes, there's always this situation where the stakeholders are demanding for actual features or actual models. While it's always a good practice to, along with features, you need to make sure you also, adding pipelines and tools and other practices to regulate your models and things like that. So what would be a good trade-off for a data scientist and AI engineer to?
Well, I think generally that orchestration should come, from above in a certain way where it's like, okay, organization is testing, we're looking at a few models, we've done some of these playground type situations. Now we're starting to see we have, a pipeline of 5, 10, 15 really good use cases that we're signing off on now that we're going to move and put real investment into. At that point, you have to start thinking like, what is your tools of choice? Is it going to be an Excel spreadsheet where you're going to start, saving all this information and potentially that person leaves and it's in a box folder and it gets deleted because you want to clean up, data? Or are you going to invest in a set of tools, governance tools to preserve this information internally and just automatically, preserve it? So the difficulty that, for instance, I had internally at IBM for corporate is like, I have so many stakeholders. So I have the people that use Watson X. Awesome. Great. They have tools that will bring in certain pieces of the metadata as the development takes place, like, bias and driv and, HAP and like all of these different metrics that are really important. Is there a protected attribute that's used? What is the data? All this stuff that gets naturally collected into an AI fact sheet. But others that produce it, maybe they're in research, maybe they're in consulting, maybe they're in a different smaller group. They still have to provide the same information. So you can either do it and use an automated tool to help you along the way, but eventually you're going to have to do it no matter what. So figure out where you want to be in that spectrum, right? Or you're going to assume that ethical debt that comes in, and eventually, like right now in corporate for IBM, you would be stopped. Like if you wanted to productize something or you wanted to move it past a certain line, there's certain checks and balances that would say, sorry, you can't do that anymore. Right. So that's kind of the happy medium to think of. You can either do it now, get the right systems in check, or you're going to have to do it later on. Make sense, Raj?
Thanks, Steve.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Thanks, Raj. Travis, would you mind sharing your question real quick?
Yeah, absolutely. So many companies that I get to interact with feel like they have a ton in development, specifically around Gen AI. But they're a little gun shy to take that to the market, despite really the pressure from the business now becoming pretty enormous because of what's been spent on R&D. So what do you guys feel like the fastest way to really properly shortcut the time to market and overcome that fear is?
So Travis, is that direct to me or you want it to the group? Because you said you guys, so I just want to make sure I'm fair.
I'd love to hear your answer first and anyone else who has input there as well.
I think it goes back to those guiding principles, right? If you can't really understand what went into it and potential implications, you're going to be scared, right? And that's really where a lot of enterprises are right now. They don't understand if what they put out tomorrow will have a bad impact for them, or there's a regulation that's coming, you know, around that area. So there's a big caution that I've heard and the people that I talk to, where it's like they have significant investment, or they want to do significant investment, but they're worried that the model will be stale or problematic, etc. Do they have the right expertise? How can they really ground it? Will the hallucination aspect be really problematic in their domain? Right. So collecting all that data along the way, the red teaming aspect where you really test the models out, test, you know, acceptable use in terms of the actual use case. Is it better than humans in that same type of situation? Or has it just been biased by previous, you know, training data in that space? Right. So that's where I think it's really important to, you know, build that metadata along the way so that it is easier to flip the switch and say, hey, let's move this to market. And the business gets behind you at that point. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Must
absolutely.
have.
Thank you. Yeah.
Any last thoughts from anybody? Stephen, any last take that you want to leave before we exit the show?
I think like if we go back and we think about those critical takeaways, the skills, don't forget about the skills. Don't also forget about the SMEs that are working in this space. Get that validated beforehand, because I've seen too often than not, you know, these solutions come out and the SMEs just think that they're a joke. Know your data, know your models, do it properly. It will save you not just for the governance space, but also in terms of the reproducibility within your company. And then continuously validate those solutions, you know, and be prepared for that wide set of regulations around this space in the coming, you know, years.
Brett came in with one. He was asking, hey, speaking of AI governance, how long until this will be automated? Will it be automated?
Well, I think parts of it will be for sure. And that's really the guiding, you know, principle. Automate, instrument as much as you can internally. I think I've reached the point of like, I don't want to explain it to more people in terms of like solutioning inside of my company, where we need to instrument the code, the releases, you know, as data is used, make sure that we collect the right information. So more and more will be automated, I think.
Are there certain areas that lend themselves to automation versus others in your mind?
I think just across there's no real issue in terms of building. You just need to build it. If you don't instrument your code and you don't understand where the use is or how things are used, you're never going to be able to automate things effectively. So, you know, making sure the instrument understand is really important. I think maybe the evolving guardrails, I think that's an area that's going to be evolving over time, that we're going to have to make sure that it's generalizable and extensible. So those guardrails around the AI use cases, I think that's an area that won't be so easy because it's going to be evolving.
Great. Well, that'll be the last word, Stephen. Thank you. Folks, how was the discussion today? If you'll finish the survey that's on the screen, that'll let us know. Later today, you'll receive the FT Post show notes. It'll give you access to the complete contact list and show data, personal introductions, leaders that could be valuable to your business. Please check out our library, our expert library at ft.network. And while you're there, why not subscribe to us on YouTube, Apple, or Spotify and never miss a show? With over 3,000 members, 20,000 followers across more than 45 industries, FT is growing fast thanks to you. Folks, we're out of time. Thank you once again, Stephen, and to all of you from the experts. We'll see you next time.